Oh, yeah, that's the way to start the week, my friends. That's the way to bounce us back into the beautiful struggle. Welcome, 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 my friends. Welcome to the Social Justice Power Hour. Welcome to the virtual headquarters of the Rustin Center for Social Justice. This is now a year and 8 months worth of doing the show every single freaking weeknight. We've been here 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific, coming at you over 400 some odd shows, many of them very odd indeed, and tonight is no exception. We started off with a special remix of our Power Hour theme done by the extraordinary Dr. Uhuru Williams, the Abs of Steel on the Wheels of Steel. We started that one because, gosh, what a great bopper to start the week, but two, he is a mutual friend of myself and our guest tonight, Dr. Peniel Joseph, who is a great friend of the show, and I am honored to say our Board of Directors Vice President here at the Rustin Center for Social Justice on the eve of the paperback release of his pivotal, I dare say, masterpiece, The Sword and the Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. But because I know Peniel brought a whole bunch of folks to the yard, friends, fam, readers, followers, and a whole bunch of other folks, I do want to give you just some highlights of what's coming up on the Power Hour over the next, the temperatures are dropping, but the guests are just starting to bring the heat. So come back to the Power Hour, and this is just, again, I promise you, my friends, some of the highlights to entice you back here to the Power Hour. Keisha Blaine is coming to us, Until I Am Free, Fannie Lou Hamer's Enduring Message to America. Just confirm this. I'm so thrilled and honored to have her with us. Charisma Price, poet and inspirational figure, spitting some poetry and talking about her journey. The Kaepernick Effect, Taking a Knee, Changing the World. Dave Zirin, the first sports writer for The Nation magazine. This is going to blow up, my friends. Speaking of blowing up, speaking of fire, shouting in the fire, Dante Stewart. Enough said, my friends. Our old friend Adam Gopnik, 1,000 Small Sanities, indeed. His monthly ruminations here in the Power Hour are so important to us. Call and response to the story of Black Lives Matter. Veronica Chambers, you know her from the New York Times. You're going to dig this one the most. Queer Yoga every Tuesday. You know we are here taking a breath both literally and figuratively with our virtual community. Our Queer Yoga master, Jasmani, brings us to virtual nirvana. Please join us for that. And Wesley Stace coming up in November, live in person. This is a safe, vaxxed and masked. Do come out for this show here in Princeton. As many of you know, we lost our center. We lost our physical headquarters during the pandemic. We're looking to find a new space to gather. It's hard to be a safe space without a space. So Wesley's coming out to do a show for us. We're very excited about that. But even before that, gosh, my friends, this very Thursday, just a couple of days away, Jill Sobule, you know your lover. I Kissed a Girl supermodel right here in Princeton. She's coming all the way out from California. You can come out from wherever you are. Enjoy this show. Help us find a new home. Gosh, it's going to be a brilliant night. Some surprises in store as well. Come out and make sure you come out for the after party as well. That's this Thursday in Princeton. Tickets are in the link in the comments section. So it's really easy to do. You can buy tickets without even leaving this space right now, this conversation. But let's get to it. Let's start chopping it up. Dr. Peniel Joseph is founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy at the University of Texas at Austin. His career focus has been on Black Power studies, which encompasses interdisciplinary fields such as Africana studies, law and society, women's and ethnic studies, and political science. Peniel holds joint professorship appointments at the LBJ School of Public Affairs as the Barbara Jordan Chair in Ethics and Political Values and in History at the College of Liberal Arts. He has appeared on CNN, National Public Radio, The Colbert Report, PBS, MSNBC, authored many award-winning books, including Til the Midnight Hour, A Narrative History of Black Power in America, Dark Days, Bright Nights, From Black Power to Barack Obama, and Stokely, A Life, which has been called the definitive, no doubt, no diggity, biography of Stokely Carmichael. His most recent work is The Sword and the Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., which will be published in paperback tomorrow. So go reserve your own copy right now, folks. As Peniel, his own self, says, quote, "So the whole world is absolutely in the throes of a rebellion against this inequality that is organized around anti-Black racism. But it's organized around intersectional injustice based on your race, class, gender, sexuality, how you identify. So we're seeing this. And I think, as Peniel says, that King and Malcolm actually anticipated this crisis. And that's why they were so interested in thinking on human and civil rights as a human rights movement. This bigger movement that was going to guarantee redistribution of wealth and guarantee citizenship for, yes, Black people, but for all people. And sentiments like that are just one of the innumerable reasons why we are so proud to have Dr. Joseph as a guest on our Power Hour tonight, but that we also have the extraordinary honor, as I mentioned, of Peniel serving as Vice President of our Rustin Center for Social Justice Board of Directors. So please join me in welcoming, folks, the hardest working man in social justice, Dr. Peniel Joseph. Peniel, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Hey, thank you, Robert Martin. It's always a pleasure to be with you, brother.
What a moment again that we share our journey in activism, in friendship, in camaraderie, in co-conspiracy has been such an incredible one, such interesting, extraordinary times. And one of the absolute highlights, one of those blessings of this difficult time has been having this journey and this time shared with you. So thank you.
No, thank you. It's been great to get to know you, to get to know the work of the Rustin Center for Social Justice. Rustin is making a comeback, as James Baldwin. Rustin is one of the prophetic voices and figures to the post-war period on a host of issues. And I think we're in a time where folks who are talking about social justice and human rights, this is a time of enormous crises and challenges, but it's also a time of enormous opportunities. But like you were saying at the start, there is such rampant inequality. We need redistributive justice. You know, certainly wealth is a big part of that. But when I say redistributive justice, I think of it in terms of how Dr. King talked about it and really how Malcolm X talked about it. They were talking about the redistribution of not just wealth, but of outcomes, not just opportunities, but outcomes. And so that means justice. That means housing. You know, we've talked about the Rustin Center needing a physical place, right? We need a context where really the federal government and the state government and local government should be supporting the work of an entity like the Rustin Center. Just like there's a National Endowment for the Arts and National Endowment for Humanities, there should be a National Endowment for social justice. And people are interested in not only just Black equality, but queer and trans and so many different people who are on the margin. So this is a moment where we're talking about it, but we're still not actualizing it in that bigger picture. And really the people who've got the money to do that, it's really the federal government. It's the federal government. And if the federal government has to do that by creating taxes on wealth, if it has to do that by raising the floor, right? not the ceiling, but raising the floor for everyone, right? So when you raise the floor, it means that none of us can fall below this floor. And that's why some of us advocate Medicare for all and abolishing prisons, reimagining public safety, or defunding the police. That's what that does. That raises the floor, helping folks who've got mental illness, emotional illness, folks who are being sex trafficked, human trafficked, taking all sex workers out of prison, taking all people who have mental, emotional, physical health problems out of prison and putting them, getting them the care that they need, right? So we live in a multi-tiered society. And that's why, again, going back to the sword and the shield, Malcolm X was saying, American democracy is nothing but hypocrisy. King was less of a critic initially, becomes more of a critic at the end, but they both come to see that you need this idea of dignity and citizenship. And dignity is the value that we all have intrinsically, right? Citizenship is when formal structures acknowledge our value, right? And that's why you really need both, because people who are immigrants and undocumented, they might not have formal recognition of American citizenship or citizenship from any nation state, but they have dignity, or they should, and every single nation state should treat them with dignity.
So there are a couple of threads I want to pull at. First and foremost, I think that you've been on the show for a few times, and we're always so thrilled, and the conversations are always so robust, so meaningful, so powerful. I think you have the most me putting myself in the corner, me putting baby in the corner quickest of any guest. That's, I think your ratio is like, I go right there, you're ready to chop it up, and I love that, and I think it's wonderful, and that's what our audience and our community want to hear. Sword and the Shield, I want to show folks, this is the new cover. This is the paperback that comes out tomorrow. There it is. I can't wait to get my copy. It is beautiful. I love it's such a distinct graphic, and it really, whoever did the design, really smart how it evokes that 70s feel. There's well done with that. And you speak in the book, or you write in the book, and you've spoken since the book's publication about this false dichotomy between King and X. And when they started, there was something to be said for that. But as their journeys, they not only started to parallel, but intersect and almost cross over. And I had the honor, and you inspired me to speak at Murray Grove Retreat this Saturday at their racial justice workshop. And what I pulled from a lot was, where do we go from now? King's last piece. And what spoke to me about that last piece was that, one, which I didn't really know, or I had lost track of, that he wrote it in solitude. So there's something we said that he had these epiphanies while he was in the same kind of circumstances that we've been in quarantine these past 18 months.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's an interesting parallel there. But he spoke about so many of these things that definitely put him in the same sort of mindset as Malcolm X. And I think that's something that we could speak to right now as we look to what is the new normal, and where do we go from here, as King asked in 68, and now we're asking ourselves in 21, chaos or community?
Yeah, one thing I wanted to say, Robert Martin, this has a new preface. The paperback has a new preface, which is like a 4,000 word preface that really talks about where we live and how we're living now. I just want to read a paragraph of it. Okay, it says, Malcolm and Martin would see the presidency of Donald J. Trump as a nightmare come true. In their own time, they both warned the nation about the dangers of racially toxic political demagogues who trafficked in divisive rhetoric that threatened the very foundations of American democracy. King railed against the rising political fortunes of George Wallace, the segregationist Alabama governor whose populist rhetoric prefigured the rise of the 45th president. Malcolm X characterized Barry Goldwater, the Arizona senator whose 1964 presidential campaign anticipated the Republican Party's far-right political transformation, as a political wolf antagonistic to civil rights legislation and the idea of Black dignity. The presidency of Donald J. Trump tethered the racist populism of Wallace to the seemingly more intellectual posturing of Goldwater. While Malcolm did not live to confront the race-baiting politics of Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon, King did, and his support of the Black Panthers and Black Power activists curdled his relationship with liberal and conservative institutions. On the eve of his April 4th, 1968 assassination, King's approval ratings among whites had bottomed out amid allegations that his anti-war stance made him unpatriotic or worse. History may very well recall the January 6, 2021 white riot against the election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris as the height of the Trump presidency. Amplifying a political script rooted in the nation's original sin of racial slavery, Trump appealed to the country's worst moral instincts to achieve the pinnacle of power. From the 2017 white supremacist march in Charlottesville, Virginia, that left one woman dead and much of the nation stunned, to his attacks against immigrants and African American and third world countries and LGBTQ, Trump rallied tens of millions in support of an updated version of the lost cause. And I wanted to say that because really what was so interesting writing this new preface, and I was writing this other book called The Third Reconstruction, which should be out next year, is that, you know, Malcolm and Martin, the reason why they are so fresh in our own time is because they really faced similar trials and tribulations, but I will say we faced them on a larger scale. And part of the reason we faced them on a larger scale, Robert Martin, is really one of the reasons why the Rustin Center is looking for a physical space. It's what Cedric Robinson calls racial capitalism, right? And for everybody out there, racial capitalism just means that this capitalist system that we're in is racialized and based on the super exploitation of one, Black bodies, and we have to be focused on that. Like they're the organizing principle, but queer and immigrant and Asian and South Asian Pacific Islanders and Latinx bodies are super exploited as well. Okay, but the reason why Black bodies have a specific relationship to racial capitalism is because of racial slavery. Okay, so that's the racial slavery, and that free labor allows for global capitalism, right? And so when we think about where we're at today, the reason why Black people especially, certainly women, certainly people of color, but Black people, they're disproportionately poor globally and not able to build wealth globally because, again, the organizing principle of racial capitalism. And Robert Martin, you mentioned David Zirin. I know slightly, really admire his work. You mentioned the Kaepernick effect. The Kaepernick effect is very, very interesting. I haven't read the book yet, but I read all of David's stuff. When we think about Black athletes, they're absolutely caught up in the web of racial capitalism because they are super exploited. And with the exception of people like LeBron James, who become wealthy, they are just high wage earners who most of the time end up bankrupt. They end up bankrupt. And people say, well, how does that happen? You used to play for the Knicks. You had this $100 million contract, which is not $100 million, Robert Martin, after taxes. Because one thing about these players actually are taxed the most out of people who have high income because their money does not come from the financial instruments that wealthy people utilize, right? So where you can escape capital gains, you can defer interest, you can defer tax payments, or just completely get untaxed. Amazon doesn't pay any taxes, right? So when we think about this idea of racial capitalism, it's important for us to understand that, you know, what we're all facing is that. It's just that in the 21st century, and especially since the pandemic, what we've seen, and we see it with the announcement of the MacArthur Genius Award, we see it with the announcement of Amazon giving 2 $100 million grants to Van Jones and the Progressive Chef, is that our social justice movement has become commodified. Some people might argue against me and say it's always been, but we've never seen so many people trying to do actually the Lord's work, but can get millions of dollars from it. And I'm not criticizing the social justice orgs or the people trying to raise money because we're in this capitalist society. this racial capitalist society. So we need to pay the rent. We need to have the light bills on. We need a place for a Rustin Center for Social Justice, right? But it's important for us to understand what we're all facing, because this is new, where we've been able to raise tens of millions of dollars for these causes. So it actually calls on us to be even more ethical, right? And have a more sort of stellar moral and political vision for what we're trying to do, because unintentionally, and this is what capitalism does in terms of commodifying things, unintentionally, there are people who are trying to do this work and say, look, I'm all for the rights of LGBTQIA folks. In the past, Robert Martin, you were not going to earn hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars saying that. There's just no way. Capitalism hadn't been able to commodify those movements yet, where they could say, okay, maybe your book, Robert Martin's book, sells 2 million copies and is in multiple school districts, and now you can do lectures at $25,000 an hour, right? And no one's critiquing that, people trying to gain access, but that's something new. That's something very, very new. And I think our work is very quickly becoming commodified. So we have to understand where that places us, you know? And this is happening. You see Robin DiAngelo was called out on this in terms of white privilege and the millions she made. And then she said she was going to give some percentage away. Like, so part of it is that there's a part of the social justice movements that have become sort of this petty bourgeois, you know, including nonprofits, not our nonprofit, which is a real nonprofit, but there are certain nonprofits that are making millions and millions and millions of dollars doing this work. So it's a very complicated time. And that's part of the crisis and challenge of this time.
And there are two pieces I want to pull at. One is in the middle of that. You made a really important distinction with Black athletes and how much money they make, because I think that's always been something I have noticed. I'm not one that follows sports, but I do follow the careers of these athletes who end up with nothing or little, and it plays into that stereotype, right? That they were lazy, that they were greedy, that they didn't take care of themselves or their families or their community. But that's not it at all. And I think that often we don't raise up that piece of it, right?
Oh, absolutely. You know, one of the best books on this is From Here to Equality, about reparations for African Americans in the 21st century by Sandy Darity and Kirsten Mullen, which is a case for reparations, but also it looks at the fact that there's the wealth inequality between the average white and Black family is so vast that you would need a 12, 13, 14, 15 trillion dollar investment by the federal government over a 10-year period to just put Black Americans on a 90% par with white wealth. So for people who've been super exploited, Robert Martin, historically, not just in terms of wages and being disallowed from unions, but in terms of the creation of wealth, but who, again, in our historical context, the reason why the owners, most of the owners are white. There's one South Asian owner, Shad Khan, who owns the Jacksonville Jaguars. The owners are only comfortable, just like, and this is true, William C. Roden, African-American journalist, one of my heroes who used to write for the New York Times. He's the one who wrote the book maybe 20 years ago, Robert Martin, $40 million Slaves. And people couldn't understand what he meant about that in terms of basketball. But he was making the metaphor, and I think it's completely apt, that contemporary Black athletes, and like I said, virtually no matter who you're talking about, because even LeBron James, who's headed towards billionaire status and who's done incredibly important things, and I love LeBron, he has been only able to monetize a fraction of the value he brought to the Cleveland Cavaliers and the value he's brought to all these franchises, the Miami Heat, the Cleveland Cavaliers, now the Los Angeles Lakers. So, the average American might look at LeBron James and say, oh, the salary is 35 million or 38 million. That's before taxes, right? He's added, say, to the Cleveland Cavaliers, both the first and second time, he added $1 billion of value to the Cleveland Cavaliers. He didn't get that back. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's one of the things you have to understand with the reason why they were William Rodin was comparing athletes during the system of chattel slavery is that those who were enslaved, whether they worked in the house or worked in the field, picking cotton, working on sugar plantations, indigo, rice, the whole deal. And there's great books about all this, right? They received no really wages or recompense for the value they brought to the system of slavery. And the system of slavery was a national system. It was a national system. So there were enslaved people in New York and who helped build Wall Street. There are enslaved people in Rhode Island, and that's why it's called Rhode Island and the Providence Plantations, right? So it wasn't just the South. The United States, Black people built up the railroads in the United States. We usually think about Chinese immigrant labor. They were part of it too, but so were we, right? So the reason why the country grew so fast, where Robert Martin, by the 1870s, Robert Martin, there are financial speculators who caused the first Great Depression in the United States in the same fashion that they caused the 2008, 2009, what we call the Great Recession. What they did in the 1870s, Robert Martin, is they created a new financial device that could make them money fast that went crashing down and then basically almost destroyed the country, right? And that continues. That's what the Great Depression's about too, and that's why we have Glass-Steagall, right? So when we think about these athletes, their role in our economy, just like Black bodies historically, has been where they're going to be super exploited. Even if you receive a relatively nice salary, it's not wealth. LeBron James has been able to build up wealth by being in all these other different ventures, right? Including the deals with Nike, but he's doing film and television in addition to his philanthropy. But we have to remember the way in which this country and capitalism views Black bodies, it is for super exploitation. And that's why, again, a great example is mass incarceration, because when people talk about mass incarceration in the 60s, they used to say that Black people were obsolete. The Black working class was obsolete. This is a massive mistake. This is a massive mistake. They weren't obsolete. It's just that somebody else is going to accrue their labor value, whether they're working or not. One of the biggest scandals in American history is prison labor, whether we're talking about on farms, former plantations like Angola in Louisiana, right? And the great book here is Clint Smith's new book, How the Word Is Passed, which I just did something with Clint, and he's brilliant. And obviously Annette Gordon-Reed, Juneteenth. When we think about racial slavery, what racial slavery does, and even after, all the Black people who are in prisons, who are in jails, all across the United States, who are on probation, parole, right? They all have value. The person who's accruing that value is not them, Robert Martin. It could be politicians who are telling people in the suburbs to be fearful of those people. It could be the private prison industry. They're about 10, 12% Correction Corps of America. Mostly it's state prisons and the administration that's set up and the bureaucracy. There's 1 million, 2 million people who've got jobs in the United States that are connected to the supply chains of grief and misery from the carceral state. It's the police and law enforcement. So somebody's accruing the value. So when you see somebody who's homeless or housing insecure in the streets of America, someone's accruing value from that person's existence. It's just not that person. That's all. It's just not that person. Like that person's life has value, both, yes, morally and spiritually, but financially too, right? Whether we're going to cage that person up, whether we're going to create new systems to tell the population they need to be protected from that person, whether we're going to hire new cops, which was what we've done the last 50 years, so that they can tase and perhaps kill that person, right? So there's value all around us. There is nobody in the United States and globally who doesn't have value, because what racial capitalism is always looking for is what? Value. It's always looking for value, but it's extractive capitalism, right? So most of the time, you don't get the value that you produce in this country, right? But even, like I said, whether you are housing insecure or you have a PhD or an MBA from Harvard, the system's going to extract value from you. So what we have to do, those of us who are interested in organizing, is recognizing that the people who are indigent, whether they're in Portland or Jersey or Austin, they are creating value. They are creating value because there are structures being developed to in quotes, protect people from their indigent or aberrant behavior, right? Right. But those structures aren't being created to try to nurture them or to try to heal them or to try to give them access, not just to opportunities, but new outcomes that we all enjoy, right? Because this is an outcome where, you know, you're you, I'm me, and we can meet like this and chop it up, right? But when we think about extractive racial capitalism, it's not interested in positive outcomes. It's just interested in the value that can be created, right? And that's why, again, a high point of it or a low point has been the presidency of Donald Trump, because what did he do? He said, look, the Mexicans are rapists. Black people, the metaphor was Chicago, and they're killing each other, right? Haiti and them were shithole countries, right? All that had value. Warning people, you know, look, he went from 63 million votes to 74 million votes. All the demonization had massive value. Massive value. What Trump did for the ratings of Fox News, but also MSNBC, it's negative, but people extracted billions of dollars. And obviously the biggest giveaway under the Trump administration is the 2018 tax cuts. Those tax cuts are the largest redistribution of wealth in American history from the bottom to the top in American history. And it's a 10-year tax plan.
And it's wonderful you talk about value as not a positive thing, but as a quantitative term. And I think it's important for our audience, for our community to understand. And this value that's been put on social justice, on racial justice, on how it's been commodified.
Queer justice too. I mean, there's people I love who, you know, we have Eric's book about the United States versus the homosexual. That was the first book by a queer author about queer history in New York Times bestsellers list for 40 years. And Eric is not a problem here. It's the industry and racial capitalism. That's the problem. If they find value, all of our stories, they're willing to commodify. And on some levels, as creators, as activists, we want to publicize the education and the work we're doing. So we just have to be careful. I'm not telling people, hey, if Netflix comes to Robert Martin and says, hey, we want you to curate something about the Rustin Center and the work we do, I'm all for it. But we have to also understand that now we're in a bind because we're connected to Netflix, right? And Netflix has supply chains that produce power and privilege and joy, and others that produce misery and grief and exploitation. And we'd have to acknowledge that, right? We'd have to say, hey, what can we do to bend the curve, even as we want to spread the message of what the Rustin Center is doing?
Yeah. And do you fear that the bottom is going to fall out of this, that all of the value that's being placed right now on the work that we're doing, on activism and organizing, on amplifying voices, do you fear that it has a shelf life or a half-life that we have to be very cognizant and wary of?
Yeah, there's going to be a window. I mean, for those of us who are been in this work, and as you know, Robert Martin, my birthday is Tuesday, right? So I'm 49. I was with my mother, who's 82. I was on my first picket line in elementary school. So it's been over 40 years in this work. I don't want people to think that the bomb's going to fall out in the sense that we stop doing the work. We're just thinking about, yes, these are peak moments of attention to the work. Absolutely. The work is going to continue, right? Before George Floyd, before Breonna Taylor, the work continued, right? Sometimes when people say, well, what happened to the movement? It's only people, as you know, Robert Martin, who aren't involved in movements who say that. When you're involved in movements, whether you're in a tiny place, we could be doing the Rustin Center out of your apartment or my place, right? Where you don't have the external resources to get a center, right? It means the movement is still going, right? But there are high points like right now, where the last 18 months, obviously we've seen it. Forget the $50 billion that was pledged by corporations, but BLM, Legal Defense Fund, people have been able to raise tens of millions of dollars for policing reform, for a whole host of different issues, right? It's not always going to be this way. You're exactly right. But the work will continue. And for those of us who know that, hey, you know, we've got a 1, 2, 3 year window horizon coming up. part of it is, and again, this is where capitalism is very much, it's a juxtaposition. It's not an aberration, but it gives and it takes, because we have to raise money. We're in the process always of raising money. I run a Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. That's a nonprofit. I have to raise money. So it's really about raising enough money during this time so that the times ahead where people are going to, in quotes, move on, right? The nation moves on, right? That we can still continue to do this work, but we'll have to know, look, we're doing this work. And right now, say 2025, 2030, is it going to be a high point like 2020, 2021? I would hope, but as a student of social movements, I'll tell you that what we saw in 2020, you don't see every couple of years, most of the time. I mean, if there's a revolution going to happen, you can say, wow, that was just the start, right? But most of the time, and we'll have to see post-pandemic, because 2020, our estimates are 15 to 26 million people came out in the streets. And that's the most in American history. And we also had the most, it's a Black-led movement, but the most white, the most indigenous, the most queer, everything come out in 2020. So I do think we're going to see a waning of attention, and we really have to see what happens with the federal elections, 2022 and 2024, because, is Biden-Harris an 8-year and, pivot or interregnum? Is this just going to be 4 years? One thing we haven't talked about yet, Robert Martin, is the voter suppression and these assaults on democracy that are being upheld in courts, that are being upheld through basically threats of violence and force. When we see certain Trump-appointed judges saying that the Justice Department should treat the January 6th white supremacist rioters even-handedly, right? So we're in real trouble in terms of small d democracy in the country, and much of this connected to race, because it's really Black voters and Black women voters who put Joe Biden over the top.
So there's the second piece of it, right? We talked about the financial concern of it, but now let's talk about the activism concern of it. How do we, you and I, but are a very small piece of a much larger, and now worldwide movement. You and I have talked about this before in the show, that it's now a worldwide movement. It's not looking at just America as a standalone piece of this. It's been erupting all across the world. How do we move forward and make sure that we are stating our concerns in such a way that they'll still be listened to in the new normal? Because what's happened is, through the pandemic and the loss of 701,000 lives now, the other part of it is it has made people so much more aware and exacerbated the social and racial and gender and queer inequities of our society. People are now so much more aware. How do we not allow us to go back to a new normal that forgets all that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I look at the work of people like Marianne Kaba, who talks about a criminal punishment system, but also talks about mutual aid societies, mutual aid networks. I look at the work of the Rustin Center. I think one of the things we have to do at a granular level, and I mean, as a board member, I'm going to, contribute. We'll talk about that after. Is contribute some money, whether it's to the organizations we have, whether it's $50, $500, $1,000. So one thing at the local, people who we trust and nonprofits that are doing things that we have to think about it at that level, at that granular level. The next tier are those organizations we've all heard of, Legal Defense Fund, which does the Lord's work, which we should. But I really want to focus right now granularly and really tell everybody what the organization that we should all be supporting is the Rustin Center for Social Justice. And we should be supporting the Rustin Center for Social Justice in as big of a way as we can. And that's through, again, if you can't be right there in Jersey, and if you can't be right there at a demonstration, that's financially, and making that commitment to say, hey, I'm adopting the Rustin Center for Social Justice. That's huge. That's really, really important, because what that sets up is what I call, or what historians call, and these mutual aid societies and mutual aid networks, where people at the grassroots are handling the philanthropy, so that a Rustin Center doesn't necessarily need a grant from the Ford Foundation or Mellon or something. If that comes through, great. But local people know what you're doing, and really a network of people across the country and around the world know what you're doing, and they're supporting that and saying, we want this kind of work for especially work that is this intersectional, is looking at the politics of queer folks and trans folks as something that is really intrinsically connected to building the beloved community, and not just this all white space, and that's what we see in popular culture. When people see the movie The Normal Heart, when people see movies about angels in America, for most of the time, Black people aren't part of that, yet Black people are intrinsic to the queer experience globally, right? And so that has become this segregated, as you know, movement and issue, but the Rustin Center flips that on its head, and that's why it's so important. It's unbelievable. So I think the way in which we combat that is saying locally, who can we help? And even if you're not in New Jersey, the fact that we reach thousands and tens of thousands of people, you've had, in addition to the folks you've talked about, Valerie Jarrett, you've had so many different people here. This would be a great place to start, where you're saying, look, I'm going to adopt this organization, and they're going to be one of the people who I look at as social justice amplifiers.
We appreciate you saying that. We appreciate all your support as our vice president. It's been so incredibly, it's been an honor and a privilege, as I said at the outset, to be on this journey with you through the center and through our parallel work. And again, it's that idea of intersectionality being something that is boots in the ground as much as it is this higher level principle, right?
Absolutely. And one of the things I write about, I've got a new book that'll come out next year. We'll be chopping it up about that next year. But it's called The Third Reconstruction, Reimagining Racial Justice in the 21st Century. And I make an argument that 2008 to 2020, and I don't close it at 20, but I go up to 20, I go up to 21, up to the Biden inaugural, is a period of a third Reconstruction. And when we think about the first Reconstruction, I really conceptualize that as right after the end of slavery, all the way up into the 1898 white massacre in Wilmington, North Carolina. So that's even 2 years after Plessy, and Black folks had some political power and power sharing in Wilmington. As David Zucchino's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Wilmington's Lie, shows us, is that whites spent the better part of a year amassing thousands of guns and threatening and having white supremacist rallies, including some with Benjamin Tillman of South Carolina and the Red Shirts, to just slaughter any Black people who would come out that first Tuesday in November in 1898. And so people had to flee. They burned down the Black press where it was housed. It's really a nightmare. There was no federal help, no federal intervention. So that period of Reconstruction is both tragic and triumphant. You get the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the end of racial slavery, birthright citizenship. And so we have to remember, it's Reconstruction that provides citizenship for all of us who might not have been citizens, because it becomes birthright, meaning that if your parents have you here, or really, we see with John McCain, he was born in the Panama Canal Zone, and he was still a citizen. As long as it's U.S. and U.S. territories, you're a citizen, right? And so, and we get the 15th Amendment, voting suffrage for Black men, which is going to be extended to white women 50 years later, and then Black women really en masse almost 100 years later in 1965. So what Reconstruction does is give us our first experiment in multiracial democracy. That's our first experiment in so it really is a second American founding. And in a way, the civil rights era of Dr. King is a second Reconstruction that becomes this third American founding, right? And I would argue that really this period of Reconstruction that we're in, the pivot points are the election of Barack Obama in 2008, the emergence of Black Lives Matter in 2013, the election of Donald Trump and the rise of white supremacy in 2016, and then finally 2020 to now, where you see the rise of BLM 2.0, the rise of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd protests, tens of millions of people out in the streets, the hashtags Black Lives Matter. You see the ultimate culminating effect of the Kaepernick effect on sports and athletes. We've seen corporate and others talk about racial and political reckoning all the way up until we continue to see the backlash, both now with the assaults against the Biden-Harris administration, but certainly the January 6th white riot. But one of the things I talk about in that is June of 2020, maybe it's around June 15th, of the Black Trans Lives Matter March in Brooklyn, right? And I make an argument in there, my book, The Third Reconstruction, that was the most democratic day in American history, you know? And I make that argument because when we think about this third Reconstruction, right? And in a way, like I said, by now I'd say it's a fourth American founding, right? Because I'll say there's the founding in 1776, there's 1865 and a new founding. There's the heroic period of the civil rights movement, which we can really start in the 1940s with Paul Robeson and Ella Baker, all the way to King in the 60s as a third founding. And I'd say that this is a fourth founding, but it's really contested, just like the other foundings are. Very, very contested. And on some levels, you see Biden-Harris 81 million to 74 million. So you can see how close and contested it is. The positive is, I'd probably say out of all those foundings, this is the first time you have a potential anti-racist majority out of all those foundings, right? And I think it's the first time you might have a majority of people who believe in the rights of people who are non-white and non-cisgender and non-able-bodied. You know, it says, imagine a beloved community where, you know, the women that we see in something like the television series Pose are part of our community, and we're not upset, we're not angry. You know, they are artists, they're creators, they're thought leaders, right? And they're at the table of humankind with us, right? Can you imagine, right? So they're at Davos too, right? And they're at the TEDx talk too. And we count them. We say their lives and their communities are actually part of our lives and our communities, right? And so from that perspective, this is an extraordinary period. And I think that what happened with the Black Trans Matters, Trans Lives March was really interesting and instructive because it was 15,000 folks. Not all of them were just Black trans women. There were white trans women there. There were queer folks there, but there were straight folks. There were Black, white, Puerto Rican, Mexican, Indigenous, Native, South Asian. And it became, one of the things that inspired it was the silent protest against lynching that the NAACP did in 1917, where they went up, maybe it was 57th Avenue, and it was like, you know, 17,000 strong to protest. And that was at Grand Army Plaza in Fort Greene. At times they were by BAM, the Brooklyn Academy of Music. They were everywhere. And what was so extraordinary about that day is that so much of our problems is this idea that even when we've had civil rights movements and social justice movements, we still otherize some group that we pick on, right? Whether it's queer people, whether it's people with AIDS, HIV, people who are mentally non-able-bodied, there's somebody who we always say, the water's edge stops here. You do not count, right? And in that context, in June 15th, 2020, it was extraordinary that so many people got together on behalf of Black trans women who are being, you know, persecuted and prosecuted and murdered at will and sexually assaulted and sexually trafficked and being told that their lives don't matter, being cruelly treated, really the politics of cruelty and racism and all these different things. And in that moment, you had people come together and you really saw the power of the Black Lives Matter movement in arguing that all Black lives matter, right? And that's one of the things that I argue in the Third Reconstruction. And I think that's a real pivotal moment for all of us, because I thought that was a great example of intersectional social justice in practice, not just in theory. And people were standing shoulder to shoulder Robert Martin, in solidarity with each other, and it was beyond allyship.
And this is, I think it's so incredible that you are talking about this, you're amplifying this. We had the extraordinary honor of having Raquel Willis, one of the organizers of the Black Trans Lives Matter rally, and almost the full power hour that we had her here for, she spoke about the power of organizing. And she spoke about, and this is before that rally, and I'm sure, as you're aware, but maybe some of our audience, some of our viewers, some of our community is not, they weren't expecting those numbers.
Yeah, they weren't. No, they weren't. And it was really, truly a beautiful thing, because people came out in the context of, I think data-wise, the day most people came out was the high point nationally was June 6th, June 7th. This is about a week later. People came out in extraordinary numbers to say that, you know, these Black women's lives matter, you know, and to really push back against mass incarceration and abolishing police. But also, you know, at the march, there was a lot of, sometimes people talk about Black joy, Robert Martin. There was a lot of people dancing and singing and eating food. And it was really, truly an incredible sight to see so many people who were straight, who were cisgender, who are saying that, no, this matters. Like, and I get it. That was what was so, because that work has been the work done over decades and decades and decades by Black queer and Black trans women, Black lesbian activists, Black queer activists who, and folks who are in solidarity with them, who've been making that argument. Obviously, Rustin is one, but who've been making the argument that, look, you know, until all Black lives matter, you know, none will, right? And to stand shoulder to shoulder in solidarity like that is really, really very, very powerful. And I think that that's an extraordinary day in American and world history. And what we need to be building on in the future in real ways, you know, because part of the problem is we don't have, you know, an institute and a structure that's endowed with $150 million that says, look, this is the work we're doing. We're going to give people who are interested in this work, including the people who are at the march, some who might have been housing insecure, some who might be HIV positive, some who are victims of domestic violence, some who've been sex workers who've been mistreated and incarcerated, who can't get employment. We're going to give those people help and ways to help themselves, scholarships, fellowships. Many of those people, as you know, Robert Martin, are writers and creatives of all kinds with extraordinary talent, but who also have been traumatized and been the victims of racial and political and gender and other kinds of cruelty that's really wanton cruelty by the society, right? Sometimes even by their own family members, right? So a lot of it is hugely, unbelievably heartbreaking, and we need to and can do better by them. And when we do better by them, we do better by all of us, which is why it was so great to see that.
Yeah, there's a couple of threads we absolutely need to pull at, and I know that our time is running short. And I always, you know, whenever you're here, I want to do a power 2 or 3 or 4 hours. But the first thing is I want to thank you for mentioning to our audience, for shouting out the idea of Black joy and trans joy, because you look at the figures in the movement, you look at the murders of especially Black trans women, and then everybody always makes that exponential to all Black trans women, like all Black trans women are tragic figures, when they're not. They're just people living their lives, but you know, and many of them are joyful, and many of them are you know, our neighbors and our friends and our coworkers and our community members and our family.
Yes.
And the moment that we other them as tragic figures, you dehumanize them even in that respect, right?
Oh, absolutely. You know, what's so interesting is it's a balance, and I think the last 18 months has given folks more of a peek into that balance, where you can talk about a community that is being marginalized, that is suffering, and at the same time talk about aspects of that community where there's great joy and there's great success, and you know, why the suffering? The suffering is because of systems and structures, and we talk about that. And sometimes the success is an example of people who've had just better outcomes because they've been nurtured, right? They're talented, but they also have been nurtured. All of us who are successful in some way, we have a starting point where somebody believed in us and showed us all kinds of love. You know, Brian Stevenson calls it unmerited grace, right? And just mercy, and says we all deserve that unmerited grace, but then we all have to give it to each other. And that's the challenge, Robert Martin. And I think what's so interesting about Martin Luther King Jr., and one of the reasons why I'm so always interested in Dr. King and Malcolm, is King's notion of a beloved community. And I think King was able to practice this with all of King's flaws in his own life, to give people grace. He didn't hold grudges. He never attacked people, even as he criticized systems. And we all deserve to give each other that kind of unmerited grace. And so many of us have not received it. And I think so much of what we're fighting for is that, you know, when you say you want to build a beloved community, you're really, and you know, Cornel West has amplified something that King said, because King says, and I have the, I just finished rereading an essay that talks about it, where he basically says, you know, great progressive public policy is what love and justice in action looks like, right? And Cornel West has said that justice is what love looks like in public, but he's getting that from King, just like how King talks about the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. He's getting that from the abolitionist Theodore Parker, but it's King who popularizes it. So much of what we're talking about, and even when we have critiques of racial capitalism, critiques of transphobia and LGBTQ phobia and racism and sexism, so much of it is about this sort of absence of love and empathy, but also grace and mercy in the public space, right? Because we all deserve it. And at best, if you're in a family unit, however your family unit looks, you give it to each other, right? You know, not just to children, but you give it to adults at best, right? And so a lot of what we want from structures and from governments and from nonprofits, from democracy, is a scaled up version of that family unit. Not a family unit that's looking like the far right is telling us it should look. Not a family unit that is forcing a religion or a certain perspective on us, but one that, like I said, is giving us that love, that empathy, that grace, but again, that mercy. Because when we receive mercy, especially when we don't deserve it, you know, good things happen, better things happen for us, and it's better outcomes for the entire society, right? Where we've built a society for a lot of people, too many people, that's based on punishment and suffering and punitive actions, right? Not for all people, because we see the people who get away with everything, and we see the people who always receive unmerited grace, but they just give that grace to each other, Robert Martin. They just give it, you know, they say, look, you didn't do an SEC violation, Robert Martin. I forgive you. You know, these little shenanigans you've been doing. That's why the only person who got arrested during the 2008-2009 recession was a South Asian executive. No white people stood trial. they received the mercy, right? And so we do have part of the society is modeled on what I'm talking about, but much of it's not. But it's modeled in a raced way. It's modeled in a way that's classed, right? And it's modeled in a way that's gendered and along these other lines as well.
I love the fact that you brought up Brother Cornel West and brought it back to its origins of King,
Yeah.
but that justice is what love looks like in public. And I was at a commitment ceremony for two of our community members last night, and it was a beautiful thing, and it just kept rolling around my mind, and it speaks to so many different facets of what we do, whether it is a large, grandiose, you know, wonderful gathering of tens of thousands at the Black Trans Lives Matter rally, or a small commitment ceremony for two men who love each other so much. And it is that, right? That's the very essence of all the work we do. Love is what justice looks like in public, right? And or justice is what love looks like in public. Or though they could be,
Yeah, no, it's both.
Right?
I think it's interchangeable. Absolutely. And again, I would add that idea of unmerited grace and mercy, because we one of the reasons why I've been teaching Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy since it came out, and so I've been teaching Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow since it came out too. And I think one of the books, those two books, what's so important about them is that they give you the facts and the history and the breakdown, but both of them, and I try to do this in the Third Reconstruction as well, they're really concerned with the quality of mercy that the country lacks, but also the times and the people and the figures in the organization who do have it, and at times have it in abundance, right? And what they can teach us, right? And so that's what's so important. We have to have a quality of mercy with each other. And even for those of us who get upset about and really angry and outraged about what's happening across the country right now. And when we're thinking about impoverishment, we're thinking about ICE, we're thinking about law enforcement and police killings that still continue. We're thinking about people being kicked off of unemployment by people who are wealthy and people who aren't showing that grace and showing that mercy. What we need to do is organize, but we're not going to get the beloved community we want through some kind of politics of punishment or systemically eliminating people who are opponents, right? You're just not going to get it. Like people who I've been in rooms where people somehow think that the way to get to the other side is basically through some kind of carnage, right? And one thing that King always talked about was you had to have moral means to moral ends. There was no way to have immoral means to get to moral ends, right? And that becomes very frustrating, right, Robert Mark? Because it becomes people are doing bad things to you, and and this doesn't mean you can't defend yourself or defend your life if you're being under attack. I'm not saying that, but there's no way for us to build a beloved community through immoral means, right? You're just not going to get it, because how we get there is going to matter. It's just like all of us who are activists. The fact that last year happened and we got that attention, but we got that attention. We weren't out killing and murdering people. We could bask in it and saying, hey, we might have been out there, but we were out, non-violently, or you were out in a compassionate way. And so you're sort of going towards this moral end of building the beloved community, but you're getting it through these moral means. And that's how you can wake up and live with yourself every day, right? So there's no way for us to sort of do some shortcut. And that's why I always tell people, it's not even about focusing on whether it's Trump or any of those folks. We can dissect them and say, hey, here's what's going on critically. But suddenly, sort of in quotes, getting rid of those folks doesn't change the society unless you go collectively through a process that does give us all a better endowment of that quality of mercy and public love, right? Until we get there, we're not going to get to the end point, right?
And I think
that's hard.
And I think that's a great way for us to let our community ruminate on this further tonight. King never saw the beloved community as something that was attainable. He always saw it as the horizon, as building toward it. I mean, that was his very phraseology, was building toward the beloved community. And so
absolutely. It's aspirational. I think he did think it was attainable, but he also knew it was aspirational. He didn't feel it was right around the corner, right? That's the whole thing. It's like a lot of what we're doing, and I think King tried to do this, you're building and Langston Hughes calls it building temples for tomorrow, right? Where this is supposed to be for your grandkids and your great grandkids, whether it's biological kin or just your community of choice kin, right? So we're all going to have great grandchildren and great grandchildren, and so it becomes, what are we building for them, And so that high aspirational citizenship, where we're not dropping bombs over Baghdad, we're not invading countries. We really are standing up and making the claim that we're liberty's surest guardian in the United States of America, because we're interested in helping. That is an aspirational kind of citizenship and even nation statehood that I think can be attainable, but certainly it's achievable, but it's not going to be right around the corner. So it's beyond a lifetimes of work. but unless you get it started in your lifetime, it's never going to occur.
And that's the kind of work we're doing here at the Power Hour and at the Rustin Center for Social Justice, what you're doing at the Center for Race and Democracy, and by writing the pieces that you do, whether it's in CNN or the next book, The Third Reconstruction, that comes out in 2022. I know you're going to London to move the message forward as well. And tomorrow, my friend, I want to both personally and professionally wish you the happiest of days. I know it's your birthday and you'll be
thank you.
with
thank
family,
you so
chosen or otherwise. And I hope that all the delights you deserve are brought to your doorstep. And bring a delight to your doorstep. Everybody to order this book. There is a link to bookshop.org in the comments section. Everything we've been talking about is encompassed in this book and so much more. It's a beautiful book written by a beautiful man containing beautiful ideas. So thank you, my friend, for being a part of our journey.
Thank you. It's always great talking to you, Robert.
And we'll see you again soon. Be well. Best to your family.
Thank you.
So that is Dr. Peniel Joseph, everybody. And this, again, I'll show you the book. Please go order a copy. Get a copy for yourself. Get a copy for a friend. Buy a copy for an enemy. You'll become a friend. Extend that mercy, right? That grace. Buy a copy for your local school district. No doubt, no diggity. And please call your local library, because as much as we want everyone to support Peniel and buy this book, there are some of our folks who know we can't afford all the books. Local libraries are their conduits for grand ideas and great notions like this. So make sure your local library has a copy as well. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Please do come back to the Power. As I said at the outset, we are here 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific, every single freaking weekend night. Please come back. We are here for you. Please be here with us. Until tomorrow, much love and respect to you all. Please be good to each other. Be good to your families, chosen or otherwise. And most especially, my friends, be good to yourselves. You need it, and we need you here with us.
We need in every community a group of angelic troublemakers.